Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, guards reportedly shot at people fleeing an airstrike on a migrant detention centre in Tripoli this week. 53 were killed in the bombing. There have long been concerns about the inhumane treatment of migrants in the country. Also, hundreds take to the streets in Gambia in support of a woman accusing former President Yahya Jammeh of rape. Rights activists say that Fatou Diallo is one of several women with similar allegations. And some of the tons of vegetable waste produced in one of Morocco's most fertile areas are being turned into a greener kind of charcoal that can help restore richness to the soil. Our correspondents have the story. But first, Nigeria says that at least 9 of its citizens were amongst the 53 killed in Wednesday's bombing of a migrant detention centre in Tripoli in Libya. The UN's reported that guards opened fire on people trying to flee those airstrikes. Aid workers say that they were clearly at risk of attack as the migrants were being held next door to a weapons workshop where some were forced to work. There are calls for detained migrants to be evacuated from Tripoli as it's attacked by forces at war with the government based in the city. Alison Sargent has more.
After dozens were killed in airstrikes, Libyan guards reportedly shot at those who were trying to flee. The latest details from the United Nations as they look into Tuesday night's bombing at Tajura Detention Center. For the UN envoy to Libya, the airstrikes clearly amount to a war crime. But the UN Security Council did not issue a statement of condemnation after the United States refused to sign on. Meanwhile, the UN Secretary General called for an immediate ceasefire and said there was no excuse for the tragedy.
The Secretary General calls for an independent investigation of the circumstances of this incident to ensure that the perpetrators are brought to justice. It is important to note that the United Nations had provided exact coordinates of the detention center to the parties.
The Tajura Detention Center is located next to a military camp. There has been concern about the fate of the migrants inside since April, when the forces of General Khalifa Haftar launched an offensive to take Tripoli from the UN-backed government.
This is a tragedy that was very much preventable. Just a couple of months ago, we called for the urgent evacuation of people from this specific detention center after a similar airstrike injured 2 of the people inside.
General Haftar denies targeting the center and accuses militias allied to Tripoli's UN-supported government of using migrants as human shields. Some 3,000 people are currently being held in government-run detention centers in and around Tripoli, where rights groups describe the conditions as inhuman. Most of them tried to cross the Mediterranean to Europe, but were picked up and returned by the Libyan Coast Guard, with support from the EU.
In Nigeria, 2 people were killed after petrol thieves caused a huge explosion to avoid being caught. The suspects reportedly breached a state-run pipeline in Lagos when they were interrupted by security officers. Firefighters battled for hours with the subsequent blaze. In Gambia, hundreds of people protested on Thursday in solidarity with a woman who's accused former President Yahya Jammeh of rape. Fatou Diallo spoke up about her claims back in June. Rights activists say that she is one of several women making similar allegations against Jammeh. Nicolas Chemin tells us more.
It's a rare event in Gambia, a demonstration against sexual violence. It comes just a few days after 23-year-old Fatou Diallo said she had been raped by former President Yahya Jammeh. According to 2 NGOs, Human Rights Watch and Trial International, Jammeh raped several women during his 22 years in power. He lost the 2016 election and now lives in exile in Equatorial Guinea.
I wanted to bring the conversation here because I think it's important and it's time that we break, the cycle and the silence, and a lot of women are really suffering. So I am inspired by women. I am motivated by all the horrendous other stories I've been hearing, and I think it's not fair for Yahya Jammeh to be in Equatorial Guinea whilst my silence protects what he has done to me.
The NGO's investigation was based on evidence from several women, 8 former Gambian officials and several other witnesses. Jammeh allegedly handpicked women he would later rape. He would provide support for their impoverished families. The former president reportedly hit those who refused his sexual demands. The results of the investigation have outraged many Gambians.
What we are seeing is a revolution. Something that has never happened in the Gambia. a subject that is not a public discourse. And so to have this conversation come out like this, for me, is one of the most significant happenings we've seen since Gambia became a democracy.
Gambia's new administration also believes Jammeh and his associates stole up to $1 billion in funds from state coffers. He is now reportedly living a luxurious but reclusive life in Equatorial Guinea. The president of that nation is his friend, authoritarian ruler Teodoro Obiang. He's Africa's longest-serving president, having seized power in a coup 4 decades ago.
Well, after months of negotiations, Ivory Coast government is presenting to Parliament a draft law on reforming the Electoral Commission. It's a touchy subject, as elections in 2010 sparked a civil war. Local elections just last year also led to violence. The Electoral Commission's credibility is crucial as the country gears up to next year's presidential polls. The changes currently proposed, though, are already proving controversial. Frank Hersey tells us more.
The plan will reduce the number of members on the Central Committee from 17 down to 15. But critics complain that the revised board will still be very much in the government's favour and in no way an independent body. In 2010, Ivory Coast was plunged back into chaos following the election that year, and the Electoral Commission was at the heart of the disputes. Over 3,000 people died in the violence which followed. And so in 2016, the African Union's court, the African Court on Human and People's Rights, judged that the commission be reformed to be more impartial and more balanced. But the umbrella group, made up of all the different civil society groups and NGOs here which took part in the negotiations, do not believe that this has been achieved.
In our opinion, the Commission does not conform with the judgment of the African Court on Human and People's Rights. It cannot claim to be independent.
An electoral commission seen not to be independent could continue to be the focal point of electoral tensions. Following the municipal elections last October, people demonstrated outside the Electoral Commission and the authorities responded with tear gas. Opposition parties are now calling for the reform negotiations to resume.
The FPI and the AFD are calling on the government to continue, to resume negotiations to fully clean up the legal and institutional framework for votes.
People are already fearful of a return to violence here next year. The political alliances that could have helped keep the peace have already collapsed. And if the commission itself isn't seen as independent, then Ivory Coast could be facing some very difficult times.
Frank Hersey there for us in Abidjan. Now, with more than 450,000 hectares of farmland, Souss Massa in southern Morocco is the country's most important agricultural region. Some of the tons of vegetable waste produced there are being turned into a greener kind of charcoal that can help restore richness to the soil. Our correspondents have the story.
In the Souss Massa region of Morocco, farmers traditionally burn their plant waste into ashes. Young local inventor Hassan El-Hemma has launched production of an eco-friendly charcoal to counter the harmful effects of this practice for the environment.
Ever since I was a kid, I've seen how farmers dispose of waste to make space in their rubbish tips without seeing it as having any value. So from there I had the idea of transforming the charcoal into dust to create a greener charcoal.
Hassan El-Hemma started his project on family land with few resources. In 3 years, he's produced his charcoal by hand with machines he's designed himself. After charring, he grinds the resulting material. Once it's reduced to powder, he mixes it with starch, which serves as a binder. Everything is then pressed into briquettes and left to dry in the sun. In order to expand his production, the entrepreneur has received public funding to set up a system of solar panels.
We finalised a lot of functional prototypes that work. Now we've moved into production and marketing.
So-called green charcoal can be used for cooking and as organic fertilizer. At the National Institute for Agricultural Research, they see a great potential in this product.
It's the best base. It holds water. It doesn't degrade quickly, and over time can be used to improve the quality of the soil. Nothing gets lost. Everything is used. So from an economic and environmental point of view, it's really interesting. For us, it's ideal.
For the moment, the young entrepreneur is mainly targeting tagine restaurants to sell his green charcoal.
This charcoal is cheaper than wood charcoal, and for cooking they are the same. There's no difference between the coal we used before and this one.
A green charcoal already making waves across Morocco and further afield, promising signs that this cottage industry can be scaled.
Now, the first of the African Cup of Nations last 16 clashes kick off on Friday. Morocco will be taking on Benin, and Senegal face Uganda for a place in the quarterfinals. Meanwhile, South Africa have the tough task of taking on hosts and favourites Egypt on Saturday. Our Simon Harding's in Cairo, and he's been speaking to the coach of the Bafana Bafana about their plan of action.
The Bafana Bafanas are the clear underdogs in this game as they go up against Mo Salah, Egypt and an entire nation. The Pharaohs, who won all 3 of their group stage games, whereas the South Africans only managed 1 win and 2 defeats in the group stages, qualifying by the skin of their teeth. But South African coach Stuart Baxter reckons that the opportunity is ripe for his team to beat the Pharaohs and to shock the African continent and the whole world as his team look for a historic qualification to the quarterfinals. Stuart Baxter, who said that his team are going to give it their all.
For us, it was close to being a decent group phase. You know, if we hold out for 0-0 against Morocco, people say, well, you beat Namibia, you drew with Morocco, and a 1-goal defeat against Ivory Coast. For a country that's not been to AFCON for a long, long time, that's maybe not too bad. It's a part of a development programme, but you know you're not going to get that sort of patience because people want to win.
So the South African coach, who is looking for a reaction from his players after not being very happy in their performances in the first half of the tournament. Well, they only will have 1 shot to make it right against Egypt, and to get those answers, they'll have to do it on Saturday night at Cairo International Stadium against the hosts and the favourites, the Pharaohs.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.